Hello and welcome to this special event, Healthy Planet, Healthy People. My name is Dave Keating. I'm a journalist based in Brussels, and I'm going to be guiding us through today's very timely conversation. We're right now, hopefully, coming toward the tail end of the pandemic. And now, quite rightly, people are starting to talk about the lessons learned. The COVID pandemic has reconfirmed the importance and urgency of being prepared for pandemics and of being able to tackle disease outbreaks very fast. It has also brought home the close links between human health and healthy ecosystems. Future pandemics will emerge more often, and they'll do more damage unless there is a transformative change in the global approach to dealing with infectious diseases, from reaction to prevention. We all know we weren't adequately prepared for this pandemic, despite years of warnings. Given that, the effects could have been much worse. The origins of this particular pandemic are still not completely clear. But whatever the cause, it has highlighted how the relationship between humans and nature, and of the unsustainable consumption practices leading to biodiversity loss and climate change, can lead to the emergence of pandemics. Even if this particular pandemic wasn't the result of such developments, we know that future disease outbreaks can and probably will result from the increasingly precarious interactions between humans and nature. At least 75% of infectious diseases in humans are of animal origin. Even before COVID-19, zoonotic diseases were having a significant impact, causing deaths, disease, and massive societal costs due to the effects on human health and livestock productivity. Many leading organizations have been very involved in this fight, and we have a lot of them here today. And they're responding to the threat taking a so-called One Health approach that explicitly addresses the links between human, animal, and ecological health. The EU's One Health approach is aiming to tackle ecosystem degradation and accelerating efforts to green economies, strengthen resilience, all as part of an overall health policy. And the EU is pushing for this approach to be made part of an international pandemic treaty. So, to discuss these issues, we're happy to gather four distinguished panelists who are going to illustrate the link between human, animal, and environmental health and help us identify multi-sectoral integrated responses that are ongoing or in the making. So let me introduce our panelists now. First, we have Pascal Canfin, a French MEP and chair of the Committee on the Environment, Public Health, and Food Safety in the European Parliament. We have Michael Kreke, Director General for Global Health, Private Sector, Trade and Rural Development at the German Ministry for Economic Cooperation and Development. We have Dr. Ahmed Ouma, Director General of the Africa Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, the Africa CDC. And we have Martin Seychelles, Deputy Director General at the Directorate General in the European Commission for International Partnerships. Gentlemen, thanks so much for joining us today. Before we go to the panel, we're first going to have a pre-recorded message from Dr. Tedros Adenom Gabrezas, Director General of the World Health Organization.
Distinguished guests, dear colleagues and friends, thank you for inviting me to join this important event and for the strong and broad-ranging support of the European Commission to stop the COVID-19 pandemic, including for a pandemic treaty. COVID-19 has reminded us of the close links between human, animal, and environmental health, which demands close collaboration, communication, and coordination between all relevant sectors. Earlier this year, WHO, FAO, OIE, and UNEP launched a new One Health high-level expert panel to improve understanding of how diseases with the potential to trigger pandemics emerge and spread. The high-level expert panel is a much-needed initiative to transform One Health from a concept to concrete policies that safeguard the health of the world's people. Building a safer world requires closer collaboration and shared responsibility across sectors and between nations. We all have a role to play. That's why WHO believes the time has come for binding international agreement to provide a solid foundation for sharing the data, information, resources, technologies, and tools that all countries need to keep people safe. COVID-19 has reminded us that for everything that makes us different, we're one species sharing one planet. We have no future but a shared future. I thank you.
That sharing of data is really, really key to what we're going to be talking about here today. And you guys in the audience will be able to take part in this as well. You can ask your questions on Slido, and I'll be reading them out to the panelists. So go ahead and submit them, and I can read them out. Cool. Okay, so let's get to the panel. Let's start with Mr. Confont. Now, I know you've been very engaged in the Parliament on the Green Deal, and you've also been active on the preservation of forests. So can you tell me, why are forests so important in your political agenda, and what would you recommend in terms of action?
Well, good afternoon to all. First, I would love to participate also to a more gender-balanced panel, and that's a message for the organizers of that kind of event. But beside this, so yes, I mean, one of the lessons learned, as it was said earlier, is that we clearly need to protect nature to avoid the dissemination of viruses like the ones we have experienced the last decades. And we have now all the data available to connect the two topics. So it's very important that we make sure that beyond or besides the purely short-term response from a health perspective, which is only ex post, meaning once we have the crisis and we have to manage and to handle it, we have to make sure that we decrease the risk of that kind of pandemic happening again and again and again in the next decades. So it's not either or, it's both. So on the second leg, so anticipation, making sure that we do not have to face new pandemics of that kind, or at least too many of them, we need to protect nature, and we need to make sure that there is space for humankind and for humans, but there is also space for nature. And we all know that one of the key ecosystems, not the only one, but one of the key ecosystems where you have the connections between zoonoses and human beings is forest. So among other things, to protect global forest, the EU will take the very first law, which is a global first. It will be in September, to stop what we call imported deforestation. What is imported deforestation is that as a consumer, as a European consumer, we contribute to the deforestation of tropical forest, whether we talk about Amazonia, of course, but also African forest and Asian forest, through the consumption of commodities exported or extracted from this forest, and then from the agricultural practices that take the place of the forest. Obviously, we have in mind soybeans, we have in mind cocoa, cafe, rubber, and so on and so on. And what we want to make sure is that the EU is a driving force to replace and to substitute deforestation, value chains contributing to deforestation by value chains which are deforestation free. We know how to do it. companies are doing it already, but let's say at a too small scale, but they demonstrated that it's feasible, it's possible. And then we have to first set the law in the EU, and then at the same time cooperate with the trade partners, with the companies that will be concerned by this regulation, to make sure that we shift the practices on the ground and we reach our objectives, meaning contributing to protecting tropical forests and having a deer-free value chain ecosystem. So that's the goal of the EU. That's the goal we are pursuing. And it's one element, obviously, among a lot of others. And I don't have to mention many of them, which are obviously very relevant, like COP15 on biodiversity and so on and so on. But this one is very interesting because that will be a global first. And we will set an example that could then be inspiring from others. And we want to do it in a robust way, but also in a cooperative way with the partnering countries.
Thanks, Mr. Confond. Let's turn to Michael Kraken next. Could you explain to the audience a bit about how your ministry, the German Federal Ministry for Economic Cooperation and Development, how you guys have interpreted and linked the two themes of this panel, which is healthy planet and healthy people? How have you been able to link those two things? And maybe you could give us a couple concrete examples.
Of course, Dave. Thank you for inviting us to give some examples and share with you our thinking about especially what happened over the last 15 months and what it will mean for the future of German development cooperation or development cooperation in general. You mentioned it at the beginning, Dave. It's not really a new phenomena that zoonotic origins affect humans and make them sick. That has been, you mentioned the 75%. It's we have prominent examples like HIV/AIDS and Ebola. But there's something that is new, what we perceive with the COVID-19 pandemic. And I think what's really new is that these spillover events occur with high population densities, very fast-paced global mobility. I would call it high-speed climate change as well. So these key factors change the dynamics of how we deal with these diseases. So when we talk about pandemic preparedness and the One Health approach, I think we should learn from these experiences over the last 15 months for future challenges that might lie ahead. One painful lesson that we've also learned is, a global pandemic doesn't only threaten global health, it threatens social stability, education, economic growth, and maybe worse, peace. So to prevent future pandemics, we need to change our attitude towards nature, especially regarding farm animals and wildlife, but also ecosystems in general. But I think it's incredibly helpful that we always link this to human health. It doesn't appeal to everyone in the same way if we say we have to save the planet. But if it's about saving yourself, mankind, and your personal health, that appeals to much more people. So the link between healthy planet and healthy people really helps us to mobilize societies and political will to do the right things. The more you link it to what affects human beings, the easier it gets to get the other dimensions also done. So what we think is very important is that we don't have to choose between healthy animals, healthy people, and healthy environment. We need to join forces, and we need to strengthen collaboration. For example, human and veterinary medicine, as well as environmental scientists. And this is easier said than done. It's actually, as we perceive it right now, sometimes it's a painful exercise. It requires overcoming disciplinary divisions. People are, and also scientists are more and more specialized sometimes. And you need to foster mutual acceptance. So we need to build bridges in these disciplinaries, but we also need to build bridges across societies, from local farmers to researchers, from producers to policymakers, civil society, business. Pascal Canfin mentioned the need for more regulation in global value chains, the first example. So all these things, they need to be brought together, I think, and this is crucial to become more effective and to really live One Health, so that it isn't another buzzword, but that is really a concept that comes to life. So as BMZ, we try to practice what we believe in, and therefore we created a new directorate called Global Health, Pandemic Prevention, One Health. So we have really new structures in place to deal with possible future pandemics, but hopefully also prevent them. So, and our One Health strategy builds very much on the experiences, not only from these past 15 months, but the experiences we gained in the field of public health, animal health, environment, and biodiversity and climate. So we try to link these things more. Let me give me two examples to come to a close. I think one good example is to reduce health risks through wildlife trade and consumption. We launched the International Alliance Against Health Risks in Wildlife Trade, Germany, together with other international partners. And we would love to have some of those listening here today to join this alliance and put substantial resources in this. We think this is a crucial element for pandemic preparedness. Second example is the so-called Legacy Landscapes Fund. It was recently launched. This is a fund to protect the most important remaining ecosystems. We launched that together with other countries and philanthropists, and these are very concrete examples on how you can live up to the expectation of the One Health approach.
Thanks a lot. Let's turn to Dr. Uma next. So the Africa CDC is leading the response to COVID on a continental scale. And you guys have launched partnerships to accelerate access to COVID testing, treatment, and vaccines. So what is the place of the One Health approach in your strategy for preparing and responding to future health threats of animal origin? And could you tell us what are your plans for integrating the human and the animal and veterinary surveillance systems in Africa?
Thank you for having me, and it is a pleasure to join the Europe Development Days session today on One Health. Now, first, the place of One Health approach in our work, it is really, really central. We are very clear that there can be no effective human health if we do not have a good health in the environment, and also animals, birds, all those that we live with on this in this world. So the One Health approach is central to everything that we are doing as Africa CDC, and I'll give a few examples. One is that, and you've given that summary, that most of the pathogens that are now giving us a lot of challenges in as far as public health is concerned are of bird and animal origin. They don't come from man. Most of them come from outside of the human being. And in this way, we are bound to address the issues that require to be addressed at the animal health and also at the environment level. So this is one thing. Secondly, is that as Africa Union, we have our Agenda 2063, which we call the Africa We Want. And that particular agenda has been set up in a very One Health approach, where all relevant sectors are coming together to be able to address issues around development, around security, around health, and others. In this way, it is the very core of delivering on Africa Union's Agenda 2063. As Africa CDC, we developed the One Health framework, and this is pre-pandemic days. And this particular framework has been guiding our One Health work on the continent. It is a framework that is primarily aimed at our National Public Health Institute, but it has very, very valuable inputs for all the stakeholders that are engaged in One Health beyond just the member states. So whether it is the private sector, it is our development partners, it is intergovernmental organizations, civil society organizations, all of them have a space in the framework that we have developed for One Health. Now, it sets up, this framework actually provides a set of minimal objectives that address zoonotic disease prevention and control. The framework also guides our countries on how they can be able to establish and coordinated zoonotic disease surveillance system when it is linked to those that affect the human being and the environment. Indeed, surveillance systems within this framework have been integrated so that there is strength in all the aspects of surveillance, whether it is environment, it is zoonotic, or it is human. And all these are coming together to address our priority zoonotic diseases. Now, the second part of this question on what our plans are, we are incredibly proud of the progress that we have made on the continent as far as One Health is concerned. And I'll give you two examples. Today, as we speak at the Africa Union, for COVID-19 testing, we are actually using our Pan-African Vet Vaccine Center, which was established to be a center for vaccines for animals, but we have used that infrastructure and that capacity to be the one that is leading the COVID-19 testing for us at the African Union. The second is that we have encouraged our member states to use veterinary services, including their infrastructure for laboratory testing, to expand testing in COVID-19. And in this way, we are seeing many countries that are actually already showing the dividends of utilizing the One Health approach, and the benefits are very well documented across Africa. And in this way, we really are quite proud that we are integrating human and animal surveillance systems to be able to contribute to the fight against this pandemic. And those lessons we are carrying through to all the other outbreaks that we are dealing with on the continent. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. That's really interesting how you were able to adjust the center. I think it shows just how much these issues are connected. Let's turn next to Mr. Seychelles from the European Commission. So as we enter into the details, we sometimes can miss the bigger picture. And that bigger picture is largely about the links between all these different topics, such as the link between environmental protection and human health. So can you tell us what those links are between a healthy planet and healthy people? What exactly is the thread that binds that together? And what has been the European Commission's approach on this?
Thank you for the question, Dave, and thank you for inviting me to the panel. As has already been mentioned, the vast majority of diseases, infectious diseases, which affect humans are of zoonotic origin. So they have originated in some animal species, animal reservoir, and crossed over at some point to humans. And this is true both for the existing infectious diseases, but also for the emerging ones. And I think we really need to understand the scale of this, because we're speaking now about COVID-19, but COVID-19 is just the latest in a long series of diseases which have crossed over to humans. And even before COVID-19, the impact of these zoonotic diseases in developing countries alone were costing illnesses in over 2 billion people a year, 2.4 million deaths per year, enormous economic damage, $50 billion in human health costs, and $35 billion in animal livestock productivity costs. So COVID-19 is just going to take these figures through the roof, but it's just the latest in a long series. Now, for transmission to happen from the environment, from an animal reservoir to humans, something must happen to facilitate or make that transition possible. And the environment generally plays a big role in this transmission. Just to mention two quick examples. Deforestation has already been mentioned. Forests, particularly tropical forests, are incredibly rich hotspots of biodiversity. So when the forests are disturbed, deforestation, for example, land is deforested for agricultural purposes or for commercial reasons, animals and humans come into contact together. And especially we come into contact with animal species that previously, or pathogens in those species that previously we might have had very limited or no contact with at all. Similarly, hunting or the consumption, and especially the butchering of wild animals for human consumption, is another obvious route of transmission because it brings humans into very close contact with potentially very dangerous pathogens. And we know that a number of diseases have crossed over to humans in this way. So really, at the heart of preventing or at least limiting the impact of future pandemics must be a One Health approach. A One Health approach is about recognizing the interaction, the interdependence between human health, animal health, and environment. And this is exactly what we do through the Team Europe approach. On the one hand, the EU and its member states work together to join forces to help countries around the world strengthen their healthcare systems, their water and sanitation systems, and to support fast and equitable access to treatments, diagnostics, vaccines, etc. But at the same time, while we are doing this, we are also tackling ecosystem degradation, and we are accelerating efforts to green economies to strengthen resilience and sustainability. And this is what we are doing and what we plan to do under the European Green Deal by working with our partners around the world to have more integrated responses that benefit nature and people. Forests, I mentioned previously, this is not about keeping people and forests apart. That would be impossible. Just to recall that around the world, 1.6 billion people depend on forests for their livelihoods, including some of the world's most vulnerable people. So this is about sustainability and about ensuring that that interaction can happen in a sustainable and safe way. Now, the WHO Director General mentioned the ongoing discussions on a possible future international treaty on pandemics, and certainly the European Union will be a driving force in this discussion, which obviously will need to tackle many, many different aspects. But at the heart of this must be a recognition of a One Health approach that connects the health of humans, animals, and the planet. And while we do that, there are, of course, ongoing actions. We are not just waiting for that discussion to happen. I just mentioned quickly two examples. The One Health European Joint Program, which is a landmark partnership between 38 partners, including food, veterinary, and medical laboratories across Europe, funded by our research program, Horizon 2020. And this program focuses on enhancing multidisciplinary cooperation through joint research projects, through education, on foodborne zoonosis, on antimicrobial resistance, and emerging threats. A second example is the work that is currently underway to reinforce the EU's resilience on cross-border health threats, and particularly on diseases of zoonotic origin, through the new Health Emergency and Response Authority, HERA, which will ensure a much better coordination than previously on these important aspects. So a lot of examples of work which is already ongoing, but of course a lot more still needs to be done.
Well, just a reminder for you guys at home, you can ask questions to our panelists using slido.com, hashtag EDD21. Don't forget, we're on channel 1. Dr. Uma, I had another question for you. So we're at European Development Days, and every year, a lot of these days are developed to talking about partnerships between Europe and Africa. So in your opinion, to what extent should the interconnected areas of a healthy planet and healthy people be part of those partnerships between Africa and Europe? And how can Europe contribute meaningfully to connect those things, to connect human health, animal health, and healthy ecosystems, specifically in Africa?
The interconnected areas that are related to, as you say, healthy planet, healthy people, must be at the core of partnership, particularly between Africa and Europe. And this is because we cannot be able to have sustainable partnership if we are not addressing the planet's health as well. So it needs to be right at the core of any partnerships that Europe and Africa would go into. And in fact, for us as Africa CDC, all the partnerships that we have tackle this issue of protecting beyond the health sector, although that is where we largely work. And in fact, there is a lot of opportunity for this kind of partnership to be able to bring meaningful collaboration. And I'll give a few points to that. One is when we are collaborating, we need to strengthen the way in which we collect our data. We need to strengthen the way in which we share our data and our policies. And I think this goes to speak to part of what Tedros was referring to in as far as the push by Europe for a pandemics treaty. This is extremely important in our view. So that's an opportunity where the data that is being collected is not just human, but it is also animal and it's also environment. There's a big opportunity there. Secondly is the way that we do our routine surveillance. There's a lot that happens in as far as communication and trade between Europe and Africa. So we need to have a very coordinated way of surveillance, and not just surveillance for the human side of health, but also for zoonotic diseases, because there's a lot of trade where animal health is important. And apart from just strengthening surveillance, we also need to strengthen diagnostics. How do we get to know when there is a problem? So that the comparative strengths and advantages that exist between the two continents need to be brought to bear as an opportunity during these partnerships and collaboration. And then finally is to create a sharing of skills, expertise, experiences between the two continents. Where the experiences that we have, the challenges that we have can be able to be shared with our European counterparts and vice versa. And that way we all grow the One Health space in a very, very organized and systematic way, and therefore exploit all opportunities that we may have when it comes to the partnership between the two continents. So there's a lot that we can be able to benefit from. We just need to systematize it so that it is contributing to all aspects of our partnership using the One Health approach. Thank you.
Mr. Seychelles, I wanted to follow up on something that you said. You pointed out that, whatever the question is about the origins of this particular pandemic, we know that there are lots of such infections and such diseases that predate it and will follow it. And as the WHO Director General said there at the opening, no country is safe until every country is safe. And kind of as I alluded to in the opening, if we have a future pandemic that has a more serious pathogen and a more contagious virus, that is a threat that can't be excluded and would be very, very worrying. And in some ways, the contagiousness and the threat of this particular pandemic we've just lived to, we can really think about how much worse it could have been. And it could have had way more devastating effects on our economy and our health, but also on poverty reduction globally. So what is the EU's international cooperation strategy here? How is that cooperation helping to deal with the human, animal, and environmental health in an integrated manner? And how can the EU support preparedness for future pandemics across the globe so we never find ourselves so unprepared again?
Thank you. I mean, no country is safe until every country is safe. And the implication of that is that no single country, no matter how well resourced it is, can address these issues alone. The answer has to be in a strong, committed multilateral approach. And this is at the heart of the European Union's efforts. We have consistently been supporting multilateral initiatives. I can just mention the most recent example, COVAX, which is aiming to ensure that all countries have access to vaccines that they need. But we're also supporting a large number of One Health projects and programs which bring together, in fact, countries in various regions around the world. We are working in this way in Southeast Asia, in West Africa, in the Indian Ocean, and many other places. Now, this is not just because of COVID. Even before COVID-19, we had already initiated a number of these projects. For example, following the Ebola crisis in West Africa in 2016, Ebola is also a zoonotic disease. We had initiated a project, EBD CERSI, which is a project in Western and Central Africa, which is a research project to help detect diseases like Ebola, which have not yet crossed over to humans, but have the potential to do so, because by the time once they cross to humans, that the problem has already happened. But we need to be ahead of events. And this project aims to, for example, collect and analyze samples for the presence of various pathogens, including coronaviruses, in wildlife, and to help assess the risk of their spillovers to humans. And we work in this project with a number of other collaborating organizations, the World Organization for Animal Health, the Institut Pasteur in France, and others, many others. We're also working in other areas. I mentioned, for example, the issue of wildlife meat, which is a really major concern. And there we are supporting programs aiming at promoting sustainable wild meat consumption, including the creation of alternatives. We're also working to create strong and forge strong technical and scientific partnerships. For example, between the European CDC and its African sister organization, the African CDC, represented here today by Dr. Ruma. I'd like to take the opportunity to pay tribute to the excellent work that the African CDC is doing. And in just a few years, it has managed to establish itself as a strong point of reference in Africa and also globally. And this partnership between the two CDCs aims to really strengthen collaboration on various topics: preparedness, surveillance, the response to health threats, and very much obviously focusing on a One Health approach. We are also working very closely with WHO for many years to provide support to help countries really have the means, the capacity to implement the international health regulations, which are really the basis for a global response. But we know that in many countries, unfortunately, the resources are not there, or there are very limited resources. And therefore, we need to invest, and we are investing together in capacity building in those countries, particularly those countries that are really more exposed to the risk of zoonotic diseases for the reasons we already mentioned. And some of those diseases could indeed be future pandemics in the making. Also, we are looking ahead to the future, and especially in the light of what has emerged strongly in COVID-19. We have also recently announced a Team Europe initiative to support manufacturing and access to vaccines, medicines, and health technologies in Africa. And this initiative will help create an enabling environment for local manufacturing of vaccines and other essential medicines in Africa, and reduce the major gap which today exists in this regard. We will be investing 1 billion euros from the EU budget and European development finance institutions such as the European Investment Bank. And to that, of course, we will also be looking for further enhancement of this by contributions from EU member states, not just financial contributions, but also technical expertise and know-how to help also in the shortest time possible really provide this support to the African manufacturing sector. But beyond this, it's really important to see how we can live in harmony with nature. Ultimately, if we don't do this, we will have more frequent and more dangerous pandemics. This is guaranteed. So we need to see also under a Team Europe approach to continue and intensify the work which has already been done for a number of years, joint responses with our member states and other partners, and very important, of course, with our country partners around the world, to support a greener and more inclusive transition across the globe. We should take now the opportunity from what has happened, the lessons learned, to build back better, as we say. It cannot be that after such a shock, a global shock, we just simply go back to whatever we're doing in January 2020. We need to construct something radically different, something which is much more sustainable, For example, more sustainable food systems, a move towards a low carbon and circular economy, sustainable energy and mobility, and fundamentally preserving and restoring, wherever possible, restoring ecosystems. This is the only guarantee that we could at least minimize or reduce the risk of what you just mentioned, Dave.
Well, you mentioned this Team Europe concept. Let's talk a bit about that. Let me put this question to Mr. Kreke. So just to explain what this Team Europe idea is, it emerged last year. It's basically that at EU level and national level, there is a cooperation to tackle these challenges. So it's the Commission cooperating with member states in order to find solutions, in this case, specifically to fight the pandemic and to prepare for the next one. So Mr. Kreke, in Germany, how has your ministry turned this idea of Team Europe into practice, specifically to promote healthy planet for healthy people? And how has it done so as a central goal of development cooperation and support to countries to build their economies and societies back to strength after this crisis?
Well, firstly, in Germany, we really strongly believe in the Team Europe approach. It's the right thing to do to bundle resources, commission member states, financing institutions, and partners in other countries. And so we are part of Team Europe. And jointly with other team members, we are currently designing a regional Team Europe initiative that aims at strengthening pandemic prevention and preparedness by applying the One Health approach in East Africa and in the ECOWAS member states. So this is one concrete example of a new Team Europe initiative in the making, together with other partners. And let me also stress that we strongly support the Team Europe initiative on manufacturing and access to vaccines, medicines, and health technologies. It was already mentioned. I think sharing vaccines is certainly important for a successful global response to the pandemic, but we need to think beyond that and act now to really, especially in Africa, but also in the other developing countries, strengthen production capacities. So this doesn't only apply to COVID-19, but also to regular immunizations. And I think it's definitely a high priority for Germany to play its part in making sure that the African continent is integrated in these global value chains of health, technologies, and vaccines. So these two initiatives are very close to our heart. But let me mention one more thing. I think we should be aware that the next pandemic may as well emerge in a high-tech pig or poultry barn in Europe. So there's also something to do here in Europe on this, not only in partnership with developing countries and common practices in developed countries like intensive livestock farming, widespread use of antimicrobials. These things are risk factors that we need to address as well. So getting things done at home in Europe is as important as cooperating with others in the world.
That's a really good point that, of course, these development partnerships with other parts of the world are really important, but not the only focus, because, of course, the next pandemic could arise here in Europe through interaction with new animal species or in any other way. Mr. Confon, let me turn to you. We have this biodiversity COP coming up. It's the COP15. What do you expect from EU member states and from the EU in terms of cooperation ahead of that COP?
Well, you know, the European way to approach this conference is to try to extract from this conference a sort of Paris moment. So having for biodiversity the equivalent of the agreement we had a couple of years ago for climate. Because we all know that I would say the level of political maturity of the two topics is not the same yet. Climate is now mainstream everywhere. I'm not saying that we are doing enough yet all over, but it's very high on the agenda across the political spectrum. Biodiversity loss, we are not there yet. I would say more or less that we are a decade earlier or later. So that's why we need to have a big push on biodiversity loss or against biodiversity loss for concrete measures, and also in terms of awareness and maturity of the political debate for heads of state, for CEOs, and so on. So that's where Europe has a role to play as I would say, a soft power, putting this idea high on the agenda. And then there are many, many ways to do it. It's through trade, through finance, and there will be, for instance, a sustainable finance package in the coming weeks coming from the EU. We need to make sure that biodiversity is treated as at the same level, I would say, than climate change. Same for the review of trade policies, as just mentioned, making sure that both climate and biodiversity are now taken on board in the trade policies instruments from the EU. I could, of course, elaborate a bit a long way on this, because that's the core of the Green Deal, mainstreaming climate plus biodiversity issues. And in this agenda, there is the COP15. So just wanted to say that it's a global agenda with a very strong European leg. But then when it's come to the COP15 itself, I must be honest, it still remains to be seen what the Chinese want to make out of it. It's a COP in China. And do they want just an agreement? Because any kind of an agreement will be a success for China, whatever the substance is, whatever the level of ambition is. Or do they want to contribute to a real agreement that will make a real change, that will be a game changer? Exactly that what we had in Paris in a couple of years ago. It's still to be seen, to be honest. So that's why Europe has to deliver on its own agenda to be credible, to use all the tools we have in our hands to make sure that we change the drivers that are leading to the biodiversity loss and nature loss, and then having a strong cooperation with China and, of course, with the US. Yesterday we had a conclusion of the US and EU summit, and for the first time, to my knowledge, the US got committed as well to the global goal of protecting 30% of our territory on marine or terrestrial. That's new, that's big. We need to keep on moving, and Europe is clearly in one of the driving seats. I mean, there is not a single driving seat, but one in the driving seats to have a real ambitious deal in China this year.
That's a really good point in terms of the difference in the level of attention. I also noticed that in the US-EU summit's conclusions yesterday, and yes, I do think that's the first time that the US has committed to that, as far as I know. So that was notable that made it into the conclusions. Let's turn to some questions from the audience. So the first question we have comes from Prerna Garg. Many layers of human nature links are essential. Can we be more observant about these connections in our culture, in agriculture, in food practices, and keep them alive? Who would like to take that? Maybe Mr. Seychelles, because you were talking a bit about this before, but aren't there certain human nature links that are good? And how do we tell the good from the bad?
Indeed. As the question clearly states, this is not about keeping human beings separated from nature. I mean, that is insulating ourselves. That would be impossible in any case. We are we are part of nature. And this is about also seeing how we can actually use natural resources in a sustainable way, taking care also to really ensure that those resources are not depleted or damaged by our activity, but are actually enhanced so that they can actually provide livelihood to people in a better way. Really, the links between humans and nature are multiple: agriculture, other food resources, but also many other reasons why. But this makes it all important to, first of all, understand what impact we are having on nature. What is it that we are entering into contact with, potentially disrupting? We need to know that ahead of the disruption and not after the disruption has happened, and then we see the consequences. Because by then you're at best in damage limitation mode, not in prevention mode. So we need to invest in things like surveillance. We need to also understand how we can support, because there's a strong social dimension to this. We need to support people's livelihood, that they can actually make better use of the natural resources available to them, and also therefore have better lives and also are protected from these kind of negative impacts.
That's a good answer. So we have another question here, quite an interesting one. This comes from Gabrezas. How is the patent waiver on COVID vaccines seen through the One Health approach? A very contentious and topical issue. Maybe who would like to take that? Do we have a volunteer? Yes, Mr. Ona, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I can try that. Look, patent waivers need not to be boxed into one approach or the other, whether it is human or animal. Many times we talk about the human angle more, but really this cuts across, including for animals and other aspects for the environment. This particular discussion at the WTO needs to be expedited, because if it is not expedited, we will have this particular virus starting to become endemic, and that can be very disruptive for all future public health endeavors. And when we look at it from the One Health lens, it is a lesson that we can be able to carry through into other therapies and vaccines that will be extremely useful and valuable in ensuring that the animal side of our lives is also secured in a similar way, particularly if it is of a public health nature. So that particular waiver discussion needs to be expedited so that we can be able to get a quick resolution. And in our view, we need to get the waiver in place. Then we can be able to produce vaccines in quantities that will address the large population that have not yet received vaccines. And this is a lesson that we're going to be able to carry through to the animal health side as well. Thank you.
Mr. Krecker, let me put this question to you. I know the German government has a position on this, but in theory, does the One Health approach have something to say about this issue?
Yeah, I think it's important that be it through patents or patent waivers, in the end, it's always about strengthening technological cooperation. And in the current pandemic, since we don't have a patent waiver now, this doesn't prevent us from applying voluntary measures immediately. So a lot that needs to be done now can only work on a voluntary basis if partners are really open to share. Even a forced patent waiver wouldn't solve the problem right now. I know we have this discussion within the WTO. You know that we, as Germans, think that there's also relevance of protecting property rights and strengthening innovations for the future. But the main point is to make sure that technological cooperation happens on one way or the other.
Okay, great. I want to take one more question quickly because we're almost out of time, but I think it's a good question. I'm going to put this to Mr. Seychelles. Does it make a difference in terms of our policy actions whether COVID came from animal transmission or a lab leak? We know this is still being investigated, but whatever the answer, should it make a difference to how we're preparing for the future?
No, it would not make a difference because, as I said earlier, COVID-19 is just the latest in a long series of diseases which, have their origin somewhere in the animal kingdom. I mean, in some species or other. Now, the exact means, will still need to be determined. But this is not a lesson we need to learn again. I mean, there is ample evidence of this. Also looking at other diseases, many of which remain with us today and have done so for centuries. I think we need to really start in earnest to really address the weaknesses that have become apparent in the international system. And we have to really start by looking at the One Health approach. I think the European Union clearly believes it's important to have this discussion, this debate on a possible treaty on pandemics. But that treaty will only make sense if it's firmly rooted in the One Health approach, because we know the likelihood, there is almost a certainty, I would say, that in the foreseeable future, there will be other pandemics. And they might even be much worse than this one in terms of impact and mortality and morbidity. So we have to really be prepared for that. Let's not wait to learn the lesson once again before we start doing what we know we need to do.
I think that's a good note to end on. Let's not have to learn this lesson again. Let's only have to go through this lesson once, please. Thank you to the panelists for some great insights. I think that was really, really useful. I mean, as we've heard today, the challenges to reach a healthy planet inhabited by healthy people are pretty big. And we've heard today examples of cross-sectoral approaches translated into concrete cross-sectoral actions. And we've also heard how Team Europe, this key term, how that collaboration is exploring how it can best contribute to support effective collaboration between health, veterinary, and wildlife surveillance systems around the world, and notably in Africa. We've also heard about this One Health approach, that it is really the driving direction that a lot of people are thinking about right now in terms of how do we learn the lessons and how do we prepare ourselves for the next pandemic. So I hope you've all enjoyed this special session. Stay tuned to this channel for the next special session, which will be Climate Action Matters: From Diplomacy to Cooperation, Support and Security, which will start at 2:30 Brussels time. Thank you so much for joining us, and I wish you a great rest of your afternoon here at EDD 2021.